Turkey's geographic location in the world cements its influential position in the international community as a critical bridge between Europe and the Middle East. Over the past few years, it has experienced deadly protests, a renewed conflict with Kurdish militants, intense diplomacy over the ongoing Syrian civil war and European refugee crisis. The nation is facing a critical turning point in history, and the decisions it makes now will have far-reaching consequences and may determine its path for decades to come. Turkey is currently ruled by the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, which is led by the sitting president Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Founded in 2001, the AKP entered parliament the following year with a conservative but democratic and pro-Western ideology. Since their rise to power, Erdoğan and his party have steadily adopted increasingly nationalist, authoritarian, and anti-secular stances as Turkish relations with the West have soured. This shift caused unrest within the Turkish population, and in May 2013, protests erupted in Gezi Park in Istanbul as a backlash towards government acts of censorship and their diminishing respect for secularism. The Gezi Park demonstrations were met with a violent crackdown by police forces, which resulted in 11 dead and more than 8,000 injured. With this response, President Erdoğan had sent a clear message that the AKP's authority was not to be challenged. Diminishing popular support for Erdoğan was reflected in the June 2015 general election, where the AKP was only able to win 258 of the 276 parliamentary seats needed to form a majority government, the first time they had failed to do so. This was a huge blow to the party, especially due to the rise of the minority Kurdish-backed People's Democratic Party, or HDP, which won an unprecedented 80 seats, or 13% of parliament. The only option for the beleaguered AKP were to either form a coalition government or force a repeat election, but failed attempts at negotiation with Turkey's second largest party, the Republican People's Party, led Erdoğan to go on the offensive. Conflict with the minority Kurdish population in the south and east has been ongoing for decades and is a major political issue in Turkey. The government has recently attempted reconciliation through a prolonged peace process from 2012 to 2015, but the already fragile situation was made worse by the war in Syria. Shortly after the June 2015 election, conflict erupted with the PKK, or Kurdistan Workers' Party, which the Turkish government currently labels a terrorist organization. Erdoğan used this to his advantage by aggravating the conflict and abandoning attempts at peace in order to push voters back to the AKP through fear and nationalist fervor. Bombings and attacks were launched by both sides and the intensity of fighting increased, leading to numerous civilian fatalities. However, Erdoğan's gambit paid off, and in the November 2015 snap election, the AKP succeeded in winning a majority with 317 parliamentary seats. With the majority parliament secured once again, Erdoğan was able to turn his focus towards Turkey's international interests. Being a part of NATO and having a Sunni majority, Turkey was naturally inclined to assist Western powers and the Syrian rebels in overthrowing the Shia-backed Assad regime. However, the rise of the Islamic State ensured that this would be no simple task. The rapid defeat of Iraqi security forces, combined with the total collapse of order in neighboring Syria, left very few organized ground troops to combat ISIS. This left much of the early fighting to the Peshmerga and YPG, the autonomous Kurdish armed forces of Iraq and Syria. With aerial, intelligence, and armed support from the United States, a Kurdish Western alliance against ISIS increased tensions between Turkey and the US, with calls from Erdoğan demanding that the US acknowledge the Turkish-based Kurdistan Workers' Party as a terrorist organization. Despite Turkish dissent, Washington continued to work closely with Turkish ground forces as Turkey refused to involve itself militarily against Islamic State. As long as ISIS did not seriously threaten Turkish borders, the conflict served in Erdoğan's favor as a destabilizing force to the Kurdistan region, and in effect, worked to decrease the influence of the Kurdish minority within Turkey. The region's balance of power greatly shifted when Russia entered Syria in September 2015. Up until then, the Turkish and Western-backed rebel forces were progressing, and an Assad defeat looked likely. However, Russian intervention tipped the war back into equal footing and ensured that the conflict was far from over. With little to no real response from Western forces in Syria, a growing hostile Russian presence, and an increasingly successful Kurdish alliance with Washington, Ankara felt it was being backed into a corner by both its allies and its enemies. Turkey responded to this pressure by lashing out and striking down a Russian bomber jet it claimed had illegally crossed into its territory. Details of the incident were unclear, with both sides claiming that the jet took different paths. Regardless of what actually happened, Erdoğan took a stand and refused to back down, not unlike his actions at Gezi Park. This response drew outrage from Putin, who sought to impose sanctions on Ankara and threatened to back away from the joint Turkish Stream project, a multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline deal. Although relations were not perfect between Turkey and Russia, the relatively stable diplomatic and economic ties were thrown into turmoil as a result of the incident. This was the gamble that Erdoğan felt he needed to make in order to display his strength and secure Turkey's position as a serious player in the international stage. The greater impact of the Syrian war is the immense humanitarian crisis that continues to devastate the Syrian people. As civilians fled the war-torn state in increasingly large numbers, the European Union member states struggled to cope with the massive influx of migrants. By mid-2015, over 100,000 migrants were arriving per month, with over 220,000 arrivals in October 2015 alone. Thousands of refugees lost their lives attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea, and the EU is desperate to find a way to manage the flow of migrants safely. With Turkey serving as one of the most common routes to Europe, Erdoğan's cooperation with the EU was absolutely critical for any kind of plan to succeed. Negotiations for a migrant deal began in October 2015 and eventually resulted in a number of key terms. First, a re-energized EU membership. This vague promise reflected the greater reality of Turkey's bid for EU membership, which has stagnated for over a decade. Second, visa-free travel in the Schengen area for Turkish citizens. With EU membership highly unlikely in the near future, Erdoğan required that real, concrete progress be made towards Turkey's relationship with Europe. Third, financial aid. Turkey would be due 3 billion euros to help pay for housing and transporting migrants. And last, migrant return and resettlement. As the most common and dangerous route, migrant sea arrivals to Greece would be sent back to Turkey to be properly accounted for and resettled. After months of deliberation, the deal was put into full effect March of 2016. The EU agreed to take up to 72,000 migrants, and by May the same year, migrant arrivals to Greece fell by up to 90%. The plan was a success. Then, on July 15, 2016, a military coup shook the nation. Tanks rolled through the streets of Istanbul, the parliament building in Ankara was bombed, and over 300 people were killed. Erdoğan, on holiday at the time and cut off from proper media outlets, resorted to FaceTime as a means of reaching out to the Turkish people. CNN Turk broadcasted the mobile stream as Erdoğan encouraged solidarity in resisting the coup, saying, "I urge the Turkish people to gather at public squares and airports. There is no power higher than the power of the people." The public responded in favor of Erdoğan and heeded his call, spilling out into the streets in resistance to the coup plotters. Having failed to eliminate the head of state, nor gather popular support, the coup was doomed to fail. Erdoğan was quick to blame Fethullah Gülen, a self-exiled dissident in Pennsylvania, claiming that the cleric had masterminded the coup. Gülen, however, staunchly denied any involvement in the coup and denounced the actions of the military. Although Gülen and Erdoğan had been close allies for much of the AK Party's time in power, an ideological divide eventually grew between them which fractured Turkish politics. Gülenists became a major voice of dissent in Turkey, and whether or not there was any proof of Gülen's involvement, Erdoğan seized the opportunity to place blame and branded the group as traitors. Erdoğan took further advantage of the failed coup by instating a 3-month state of emergency, launching a massive purge to silence Gülenists and any other remaining dissidents. As of now, the government has dismissed or suspended more than 110,000 people, many of which are civil servants, academics, judges, and police. This move signifies a new leap in authoritarianism for the AKP, showing that Erdoğan is willing to systematically sacrifice his people's liberty in order to consolidate power and silence opposition. The latest targets have been the most controversial yet. The editor of one of Turkey's most respected newspapers, Cumhuriyet, as well as leaders of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, were all arrested in early November 2016 for suspected terrorist links. Unsurprisingly, the strategy drew heavy criticism from Western allies, but Erdoğan was unmoved in light of weak support from the West in condemnation for the coup and Washington's refusal to extradite Gülen. In a live broadcast, Erdoğan accused the United States of supporting terrorism by refusing to give up Gülen, and even implied that Washington was involved in planning the coup itself. Later on, Erdoğan responded to criticism over the HDP arrests and accusations of authoritarianism by claiming, quote, "I don't care if they call me a dictator or whatever else. It goes in one ear and out the other." So what does this all mean for the future of Turkey? Well, in the short term, Erdoğan's efforts at purging opposition are proving to be effective in stabilizing the nation after the coup. However, the long-term effects of this shift towards authoritarianism could be devastating. Virtually any remaining chance of EU membership for Turkey in the foreseeable future has vanished, and foreign investment in Turkey is becoming less and less appealing as the purges intensify. The Turkish lira has been on the decline, losing almost half its value against the US dollar since the Gezi Park protests in 2013, and is expected to sink even lower. Social unrest and dissent has so far been kept in check through fear and censorship, but if Erdoğan keeps pushing the limits of state power, a civil backlash will become increasingly likely, which will only compound the nation's economic issues. Erdoğan has also sought to become closer with Russia by warming up relations with Putin and backtracking on the heated rhetoric which resulted from the bomber jet incident. By doing so, he is keeping his diplomatic options open and showing NATO allies that he can look elsewhere for support if needed. This is especially important given the recent election of Donald Trump to the United States presidency, who has called into question the effectiveness of NATO and threatened to pull American military support from member nations. Despite all this, Turkey is still an important member of the alliance, and given Mr. Trump's war rhetoric towards Putin and overall indifference to authoritarianism, it is likely that Turkey will maintain relatively strong diplomatic and economic ties with its Western allies. South of the border in Syria and Iraq, Turkey will look to exert as much influence as it can during the offensives against the Islamic State's last major strongholds. Near Mosul, the campaign is currently being led by a coalition of Kurdish Peshmerga, US Special Forces, and Iraqi militias and military. Turkey has strongly insisted in being involved militarily in the conflict, but the Iraqi government has so far refused their requests. Erdoğan is keen on doing whatever he can to make sure that the Kurds do not establish a stable stretch of territory across the southern border. It is unlikely that Iraq will change its mind on Turkish intervention, but we can expect Erdoğan to keep a very close eye on the situations in Mosul and Raqqa and insert himself into the equations whenever possible to shape the outcome in Turkey's favor. Whatever happens, Turkey will surely continue to play a major role in the politics of the Middle East, but the instability it currently faces throws uncertainty into what kind of role it will assume. As Erdoğan's hunger for power grows, so does the concern of Turkish liberals and their Western counterparts that the open and secular Turkey they once knew may be vanishing before their eyes. But that's just my 2 cents.